I call the member for Wright.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There's absolutely no shame, Mr Speaker, no shame whatsoever in opposing this tax. In fact, opposing this tax is the only moral defensible position to take, because not only is the carbon tax a bad piece of policy, it's the product of an unprecedented deceit betrayed on the Australian people. When the Prime Minister looked straight down the barrel of a TV camera and said that there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead, people took her at her word. And when the Deputy Prime Minister Wayne Swan told the Australian people that he rejects this hysterical allegation that somehow we were moving towards a carbon tax, people believed him as well. One of the fundamental rules of parliamentary democracy is that you simply cannot promise one thing a week before an election and do the exact opposite 6 months after. The Prime Minister has attempted to explain away this towering deceit by saying that she could never have foreseen the hung parliament. But that's besides the point. In a democracy, politicians are expected to give an honest account of their intentions before an election and remain true to that statement after the election. They're the rules. Moving on to the policy itself, I want to clear up something straight away, and that's the suggestion that Australia is somehow dragging its feet on emissions reductions. Nothing could be further from the truth, Mr Speaker. Australians are quite rightly sickened to death of sanctimonious lectures by their political leaders about how we're the highest per capita emitters of carbon dioxide in the world, as if being Australian is somehow shorthand for being greedy or irresponsible. Mr Speaker, Australians are not such thing. In fact, Mr Speaker, we have an outstanding record of meeting our commitments to climate change action. Australian carbon dioxide emissions account for around 1.3% of global emissions. Not bad considering we're the 13th largest economy in the world. Under the Kyoto Protocol, Australia committed to limiting our emissions to 108% of our 1990 levels. What was lost in the subsequent political bungfight about whether or not to ratify the protocol was that we actually came well in under the targets with an increase of just 3%. By way of contrast, Mr Speaker, Canada promised 6% reductions but is on track to deliver a 27% increase. Japan also promised 6% reductions but is likely to deliver an 8% increase. New Zealand promised to keep emissions static but faces a 26% increase, and the European Union is going to fall well short of their promised 8% reduction. And what about China and India? Well, what about China and their 2020 emissions? They will be 500% higher than they were in 1990. And India are on track to grow by 350% over the exact same period. So compared to many of our peers, Australians are entitled to hold their heads high, and that is something that we ought to remember as the prospect of any meaningful international agreements recedes. Despite the Prime Minister says about the supposed widespread take-off of carbon pricing overseas, the fact of the matter is that there is no other country in the world that has implemented or even considering implementing an economy-wide carbon tax like those opposites are proposing. Canada, America, Japan, New Zealand, none of these countries are even thinking about an economy-wide carbon tax. The only place, Mr Speaker, that has anything like what the Labor Party is proposing is the European Union. That lumbering and undemocratic superstate which is doing such a sterling job of looking after their economy. And even there, Mr Speaker, the European ETS is a piecemeal thing with nowhere near the financial impacts of the one being proposed by this Labor government. As we know, Mr Speaker, in the first 5 years of its existence, the European Union ETS raised $500 million. In Australia, we're looking at about $9 billion. $9 billion. That's 18 times as much as that was raised in the United EU, being gouged out of our economy, 1/13 of the size. Now, just to put that into perspective, the European Union has a population of about 500 million people. So that equates to about $1 a head. With our $9 billion, which is going to be gouged out of our economy, that calculates around $400 per head, Mr Speaker. $400 a head. According to a recent World Bank report, the history of the European Union ETS has been one of ongoing rorting, frauding, money laundering and outright theft. And it's not surprising, as you might imagine, Mr Speaker, The buying and selling of carbon credits is inconsistently regulated marketplace across a dozen different countries as a recipe for every kind of fraud that you can imagine. So what we have is a government that couldn't even give away ceiling installation with making a multi-billion-dollar mess of it, now preparing to implement an incredible, complicated carbon pricing scheme, 18 times the size of that that's been rorted sideways in Europe. It doesn't sound like to me that it's going to be... It sounds to me like it's going to be a recipe for the disaster. Meanwhile, our trading partners in Southeast Asia must be looking on with disbelief as we prepare to tax ourselves on the inputs they value add and then export worldwide. In fact, Australia's decision to go alone places our competitors at a competitive advantage and thereby actually decreasing the incentive for them to follow our lead. And that, Mr Speaker, is an enormous problem because the government expert modelling doesn't just predict that they will do so, it actually depends on it. Inherent with the government's modelling is the frankly delusional assumption that upon seeing what we've done, the rest of the world will suddenly realise the errors of their way and promptly sign up to a global agreement. It's simply not going to happen. In fact, there's every indication that the complete opposite is more likely to be the case. After all, the lofty titled Accord that came out of Copenhagen was nothing more than a collection of idle promises, non-binding, unmeasurable and unverifiable. And just as Copenhagen gave us the Accord, the subsequent rounds of talks in Cancun gave us more of the same. In these conditions, Mr Speaker, there is absolutely no reason to believe that the next round of talks due to take place in Durban later this year will produce binding global agreement. Yet the entire economic rationale of the carbon tax is based premisely on that assumption. Before moving on, Mr Speaker, it is relevant to note that the absolute stinking hypocrisy of the union movement in all of this, it's the fact that the union bosses will always support a bad Labor government over any coalition agreement. But the craven way in which they have genuinely reflected to the Greens-led environment lobby and thereby abandon their own members should be a source of enduring shame. It was only a few short years ago, Mr Speaker, that the union movement are mobilised en masse to shriek about the coalition's job-destroying industrial relations laws. We all remember the repeated demands of the guarantee that no worker would be worse off. Fast forward to the present day and suddenly the prospect of widespread redundancies and even the demise of the entire industries can't provoke so much as a whimper of a protest from the union movement. And it's any wonder, Mr Speaker, that the majority of Australian workers see the unions now for what they are, out of touch, irrelevant and more interested in the perks and fringe benefits than protecting the interests of their members. While we're talking about the threats of the job security, Mr Speaker, I'd like to mention a few businesses in my electorate of Wright which are set to experience real pain under this carbon tax. First, there's AJ Bush and Sons, a 100-year-old company still owned by an Australian family. Bush is an animal byproduct rendering business which produces proteins, tallows and organic fertilisers. David Kozulki and his team there run one of the most energy-efficient setups imaginable, using biogas produced on-site to power their generators and using leftover water to irrigate nearby farmland. Research out of the United States indicates that for every metric tonne of carbon dioxide produced by the rendering process, 7.2 tonnes of carbon are removed from the environment, producing a net decrease in the atmospheric CO2. Then we have Nolan's Transport, another 100-year-old family-owned business, along with my entire transport sector within the electorate of Wright. Calfresh produce a great deal of the fresh produce that you see in your supermarkets. Gilletta Ag, one of the world's leading suppliers of gelatin and collagen. All of these companies are big employers in my electorate, and all of them in line for an absolute walloping from a government carbon tax, with the flow-on effects to the local communities which will be immeasurable. And what for the community? What about the ordinary mums and dads struggling to pay the bills? What about the retirees like Walter and Nancy Beale from Coralbin who are finding it hard just to make ends meet at the moment? What about the young couples trying to set themselves up for the future? And what about the flood victims in my electorate that are still trying to get back on their feet after losing absolutely everything they owned earlier this year? What does this tax mean for them? What it means is that life is about to get a lot more expensive. Both the Prime Minister and the Environment Minister have all but admitted as much. In February this year, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "I also want to be very clear with Australians about what pricing carbon does. It has price impacts. It's meant to. That's the whole point. The following month it was the Environment Minister's turn. Again, I'm quoting directly here. The true cost of carbon pollution needs to be attached to production and its use. Put another way, the carbon emissions need to have a price, and it's the price that changes behaviour. I couldn't have put it better myself, Mr Speaker. This government wants us to sit in the dark. And yet, despite the implementing financial pain and despite the fact that the whole point of the carbon price is to make things more expensive so people will consume less of them, the government still wants you to believe somehow that 9 out of 10 families are going to be actually 20 cents a week better off. 20 cents a week. Honestly, Mr Speaker, after the litany of stuff-ups and blowouts from this government, we're now expected to believe that the capacity and the accuracy of calculating this cost of an individual household, they can calculate it down to the cent. And even if they could, Mr Speaker, even if they could, what do we get for all of this? What sort of emissions reductions will all this economic pain buy? Because, after all, if the carbon price doesn't reduce emissions, then it's just another tax. Just a great big punitive tax to go alongside the 14 others Labor has either introduced or increased since taking office. Well, according to the government's own figures, and here's the clanger, carbon dioxide emissions will still go up. They will still go up under this scheme, which renders the whole thing completely and utterly pointless. This has led some observers, Mr Speaker, to suggest that the first and foremost that the carbon tax is a vehicle for wealth distribution rather than a response to climate change, and allow me to expand. The carbon model is inefficient because it requires tens of billions of dollars to be spent on compensation. In contrast, the coalition policy requires no compensation because it doesn't drive up electricity prices. A report by Frontier Economics exposed this fact with an analysis it did based on Treasury's 2008 modelling of a carbon price. Looking at electricity generators alone, it found that the actual cost of technology reduced CO2 emissions from 2012 to 2020 was $6.6 billion. However, during that period, the government would reap $37.5 billion in tax from generators, and consumers would pay an extra $45 billion for electricity. So the government tax is almost 6 times the actual abatement cost, and the increased cost of electricity is nearly 8 times the actual abatement cost. And what happens to all this money? Well, most likely it gets churned through the Labor green machine and handed out to their preferred beneficiaries. In conclusion, Mr Speaker, the carbon tax is without a doubt the most intellectually dishonest piece of policy that I've seen since coming to this place. It was introduced on the back of deceit. It is a poorly designed piece of legislation, and it will not work. And for these reasons alone, it deserves to be the sad and sorry epitaph of a sad and sorry government. If you're so confident, if the government is so confident about this bill, then take it to the Australian people. If it is so confident, take it to my mums and dads. If you are so confident about this bill, take it to my people. Take it to my people who are the silent majority of this nation, Mr Speaker.